The old man sitting across from me at the hospital discharge desk had his hands folded on the counter, and he wasn't looking at my face. He was looking at the watch on my left wrist, not a glance, a stare, the kind that makes you check if something is wrong with you. "Excuse me," he said. His voice was steady, but something underneath it was not. "Where did you get that watch?" The waiting room behind us was loud. Someone's child was crying. A woman at the front desk was spelling her last name for the third time. None of it registered. "It was my grandfather's," I said. "He passed away 2 months ago." The man went very still. He was maybe 70, heavy-set, wearing a fleece vest with a hospital volunteer badge clipped to the front. His name tag said Gerald. He looked at the watch the way you look at something you thought no longer existed in the world. "I'd like to show you something," he said quietly, "if you have a few minutes." That was the moment I understood that the man my family had written off for the last decade of his life was not the person any of us believed him to be. My grandfather, Walter Sims, lived alone in a duplex in Decatur, Georgia. He'd been there since my grandmother passed in 2009. The neighborhood was fine, the kind of place where people mowed their own lawns and left casseroles on porches when someone got sick. But the apartment itself was just functional. 2 bedrooms he didn't need, a kitchen he barely used, a recliner facing a television that stayed on more for noise than for watching. He'd worked as a mail carrier for 30 years, retired in his early 60s, and spent the years after that doing not very much that anyone could see. My mother visited twice a year, sometimes once. My aunt flew down from Cleveland every other Thanksgiving but usually found a reason to stay at a hotel. My uncle on my grandfather's side had stopped calling around 2017, and nobody pressed him on why. And my father, who never warmed to his father-in-law even in the best years, treated every mention of Walter the way you treat a minor but persistent inconvenience. Politely, briefly, then you move on. I was different, or I told myself I was. I called him every Sunday for most of my 20s. We talked for maybe 10 minutes. He'd ask about my job. I'd ask about his knee. He'd say the Braves were frustrating him. I'd say I didn't really follow baseball, and then we'd run out of things and say we'd talk next week. I thought that counted for something. Now I'm not sure it counted for much. When he got sick the first time, in the spring before last, my mother said the doctors were optimistic. When he got sick the second time, she said he was managing. By the time I drove down to see him in November, he'd been in and out of Emory 3 times, and no one in my family had stayed with him past a long weekend. I live in Charlotte. The drive is 4 hours. I'd done it exactly twice in the last 3 years. He was smaller than I remembered. That's the first thing I noticed. Not thinner exactly, just contracted somehow, like the space he took up in the world had quietly reduced itself. He was glad to see me. He made that clear without making a production of it, which was his way. He asked if I'd eaten. I said I'd grabbed something on the highway. He nodded and said there was soup in the cabinet if I wanted it later. We watched television together that evening. He fell asleep in his chair around 8. I sat on the couch in the dark and watched him breathe and thought about all the Sundays I'd called him from the parking lot of a grocery store with one hand on the door handle, half in and half out, treating the call like something to complete before I went inside. He died in January, a Thursday morning. I was in a meeting at work when my mother called. He'd been alone. The neighbor downstairs heard the television still running at noon and knocked on the door. I drove down that night. The apartment was exactly as it always was. Television off now. Recliner empty. The same faded photograph of my grandmother on the bookshelf that had been there since I was a child. I walked through the room slowly, not sure what I was doing there. Not sure what I was looking for. In his bedroom, on the nightstand beside a glass of water he'd never finished, was the watch. I'd seen it my entire life. He wore it almost every day. An old Hamilton field watch, military style, with a worn leather strap he'd replaced himself more than once. The face was clean and simple. What I'd never paid attention to was the back. When I picked it up off the nightstand, I turned it over and saw the engraving. Not his name. Not a date. A series of letters and numbers arranged in a pattern that didn't look decorative. It looked like it was meant to mean something specific to someone who knew how to read it. I remembered asking him about the watch once when I was maybe 14. He'd looked at it the way you look at something you've been carrying so long you sometimes forget it's there. "It keeps good time," he said. That was all. I put it on before I left. The strap was too long and I had to use the last hole. But it felt right in a way I couldn't explain. Like I was taking something with me that shouldn't be left behind. My mother didn't know anything about the watch. I asked her in the car on the way to the funeral home the next morning. It was just his watch, she said. He wore it every day. Did he ever talk about where he got it? She glanced at me. No. Why? The back has an engraving. It's not his name or anything personal. It looks like some kind of code. She was quiet for a moment. Your grandfather was a mail carrier, sweetheart. I think you might be reading into things. I let it go. But I looked at the engraving again that night in the hotel, under the lamp on the nightstand, and I was certain of one thing. It wasn't random. The pattern was too precise. Someone had put it there deliberately. The funeral was small. My mother and aunt. My uncle who appeared after years of silence and stood near the back like he wasn't sure he was welcome. A handful of people from the neighborhood. A man from the Postal Retirees Association who said a few words about 30 years of service and never being late. I stood at the grave and thought about the phone calls I kept short. About the long weekends I could have driven down and didn't. About the soup in the cabinet he'd offered me from a hospital bed because that was still how he thought about taking care of people. I didn't cry at the grave. I cried in the car alone, on the way back to the hotel, which felt more honest somehow. 2 weeks later I was back in Charlotte, back at work, back to the regular shape with my days. But something sat with me. Not grief exactly, though that was there too. More like a sentence with no ending. A door left open in a house I kept walking past. I wore the watch every day. I couldn't tell you why. It didn't match most of what I wore. The strap needed replacing again, but I'd put it on the morning after he died and I hadn't taken it off. 6 weeks after the funeral, my hospital ran a volunteer recognition luncheon. I work in hospital administration at Atrium Health, not clinical, mostly logistics and compliance. But we're invited to these events because they matter to the culture of the place. I went because my manager asked me to represent our department. I wore a plain gray dress and the watch and thought about nothing more significant than whether the food would be worth the 2 hours. That was where I met Gerald. He didn't explain himself at the discharge desk. He asked my name, my grandfather's full name, and he wrote both down on the back of a business card, with a pen he kept in his vest pocket. Then he told me he'd like me to meet someone and that he'd be in touch. I stood there turning the watch on my wrist, feeling something I couldn't name. He called 3 days later. He said there was someone who had known my grandfather, not personally but professionally, and that she'd like to speak with me if I was willing. He said it might be difficult to hear, but that he thought I deserved to know. I said yes before he finished the sentence. Her name was Ruth Alderman. She was in her mid-70s, and she met me in a coffee shop near the Decatur library on a Wednesday morning. She wore her gray hair short and carried herself with an economy of motion that reminded me of people who've spent a long time being careful without calling attention to the fact that they're being careful. She had a cup of tea she didn't touch for most of the conversation. I owe you an explanation for why Gerald approached you the way he did, she said when I sat down. He recognized the watch. I asked him to reach out if he ever saw it again. You've been looking for it. Not actively, she said, but we knew it was out there. And when it surfaces, we pay attention. I waited. She folded her hands around her cup. Your grandfather served as a mail carrier for 30 years, which you know. What you don't know is that for a significant portion of that time, he was also part of a federally coordinated program that used civilian infrastructure to support domestic counterintelligence operations. I heard what she said. I processed each word individually. And then I said, my grandfather was a mail carrier from Decatur, Georgia. Yes, she said, that was his cover, and it was a very good one. She explained it carefully. During the Cold War, the federal government had quietly embedded certain civilian workers in roles that gave them access to physical mail routing, which was at the time one of the most reliable and monitored channels of covert communication. These individuals weren't agents. They didn't carry weapons or go overseas. They monitored. They flagged. They maintained dead drops and passed information through channels built into the ordinary infrastructure of American daily life. A postal route isn't a dramatic place to run an intelligence operation. That was the point. The watch, she said, was issued to individuals who were read into the program. It contained an identifier on the back. The engraving was a code that allowed operatives to recognize one another without having to make contact that could be observed. I looked down at my wrist. He maintained his role for over 20 years, she said, without once compromising the network he was part of. He retired from the Postal Service. He went home and he watched television and he grew tomatoes in pots on his back porch, and he never said a word to anyone. I thought about the tomatoes. 3 ceramic pots lined up on the little porch off his kitchen. He brought them inside during cold snaps. I'd made fun of him once for how seriously he took them. My family had no idea, I said. No, she said. They weren't supposed to. He died alone in his apartment. She was quiet for a moment. I know. He spent the last 10 years of his life basically invisible to everyone who was supposed to love him, and he spent the 30 years before that doing something that mattered, and none of us knew. That is the nature of this kind of service, she said. The people who do it understand going in that there is no recognition, no ceremony, no record that anyone will ever read. You do the work because the work needs doing, not because anyone will know you did it. I looked at the watch for a long time. Why are you telling me now? I asked. Because the program has been fully closed for over 15 years, she said. The classification status of this particular operation has been reduced. And because your grandfather's file contained a handwritten note. He submitted it through official channels when he retired from the program. It said that if he ever passed away and anyone from his family came asking questions about the watch, they should be told the truth. She reached into her bag and placed a folded piece of paper on the table. The paper was old, the fold lines deep and soft. That's a copy, she said. The original is in a file somewhere in a building neither of us will ever visit. But he wanted it on record. I unfolded it. His handwriting was the same cramped, careful script I'd seen on birthday cards my whole life. If someone is asking about the watch, that means they were paying attention. Most people never do. I don't hold that against them. Some people aren't built to look at things closely. But if someone is asking, tell them this. I don't regret any of it, not one day. I only regret that I couldn't explain to the people I loved why I was the way I was. I was trained to be invisible. I got good at it, sometimes too good. If someone is asking, they deserve to know that what looked like nothing was never nothing. It was everything I had to give. I read it twice. Then I sat with it for a while without speaking. Ruth didn't rush me. He had a daughter, I said finally. My mother. She thought he was just a quiet man who liked baseball and kept to himself. He was also that, she said. The two things were both true. I called my mother that evening from the parking lot outside the coffee shop. I sat in my car for 20 minutes before I dialed. She didn't believe me at first. She said it gently, the way you're gentle with someone you think might be unwell. Honey, Dad was a postal worker. He sorted mail in a warehouse for 30 years. He also did something else, I said. I have a copy of something he wrote. I'm going to read it to you. I read her the note. She was quiet through all of it. When I finished, she didn't say anything for a long time. That's his handwriting, she said finally. Her voice had changed. I know. Where did you get this? I told her about Ruth, about Gerald recognizing the watch, about the program, the engraving, the 20 years of work nobody knew about. He never said anything, she said. Not one word. Not even a hint. He couldn't. Another long pause. I used to think he was just shy, she said. Or that he didn't know how to connect. I thought he was withholding somehow. Like there was something wrong with him. There wasn't. No. Her voice was very quiet. There wasn't. No. Her voice was very quiet. There wasn't. I drove back to Charlotte that night. 3 hours of highway in the dark, the watch on my wrist catching light from passing cars. I kept thinking about who he'd been to me for my entire life. The man who offered soup from a hospital bed, who fell asleep in his recliner with the television on, who named his tomato plants and replaced the watch strap himself when it wore out, because he didn't see the point in buying a new one. I thought about every Sunday phone call I'd ended in a parking lot with my hand on a door. My aunt called me the next morning. My mother had told her. She was crying before she said hello. I stayed at a hotel, she said. Every time I came down to see him, I said it was because I sleep better in my own space. But the truth is, the apartment made me sad. I didn't know what to say to him. I thought he didn't need us around. He probably did, I said. He just wouldn't have said so. That's what I mean, she said. I knew he wouldn't say so. So I stopped trying to read between the lines. It was easier. My uncle sent me a text that night. 3 sentences. I heard what you found out about Dad. I don't know what to do with it. I should have called more. We had a memorial gathering in March, 2 months after the funeral. My mother organized it. Not a religious service, just people at the house my grandfather had lived in, the one we'd gotten permission from the new tenants to use for the afternoon. His neighbor, Mrs. Patterson from downstairs, came and told me he used to bring her newspaper to her door every morning because she had a bad hip. She said he'd done it every single day for 4 years without ever mentioning it. She thought of him as the quiet man upstairs who was always around. Gerald came. He stood near the back and didn't speak much. Ruth sent flowers and a card with a note that said only, "He deserved this." My mother stood by the window holding a photograph I hadn't seen before. It was from the 80s, my grandfather in a postal uniform, younger than I'd ever known him, squinting into the sun outside what looked like a sorting facility. The watch was on his wrist. I used to think he was proud in a bad way, she said, like he thought he was above asking for help. Now, I think he was just protecting us. He didn't know another way to do it. My aunt said, he came to every school play I was ever in, every single one. He drove 2 hours each way and never complained. Nobody talked about counterintelligence or the Cold War or the program. They talked about the man they'd known, the soup and the newspaper and the tomatoes and the school plays. The quiet Saturday afternoons when he'd sit on the porch without saying anything in particular, and somehow that was fine. My uncle, who had flown in from Portland, stood by the old recliner that the new tenants had kept because it was comfortable, and said, I stopped calling because I never knew what to say to him. I thought the silence meant something was wrong between us. Maybe it did, I said, but not because of him. He nodded. He didn't argue. After everyone left, I sat in the empty apartment alone for a while. The recliner, the bookshelf, the window that faced the street. I thought about all the evenings he'd sat here by himself, carrying something enormous that he'd chosen to carry quietly, watching the Braves lose games and letting the television fill the silence. I found your note, I said to the room. You were right that someone would ask. Nothing answered, but something in my chest that had been sitting heavy since January loosened a little. Ruth sent me one more thing the following month. A photocopy of a single page from an internal report, almost entirely redacted. Black lines over nearly everything. But at the bottom of one section, next to a long black rectangle where a name should have been, were 3 words that had not been covered. Reliable, precise, indispensable. I had it framed. It's on my wall now, next to a photograph of him on the porch with the tomato pots. I still wear the watch every day. The new strap is plain brown leather, the same style he always chose. I had a watchmaker clean the mechanism and check the movement. He said it was in remarkable condition for its age. Whoever had owned it, he said, had taken very good care of it. I told him my grandfather owned it for most of his life. He nodded and handed it back carefully, like he understood that it was more than what it appeared to be. My family is different now. Slowly, in the way that real change happens. Not a single dramatic shift, but a gradual relearning. My mother calls me on Sundays now. She doesn't keep it short. We talk about her week and my week, and sometimes she talks about him. Something she remembered, some small moment she'd filed away without knowing why. My aunt drives to visit my mother twice a year instead of once. My uncle calls. He's not good at conversation. Neither am I really. We manage. I notice things differently at work now. The volunteer coordinator who stays an hour late every Thursday to finish paperwork and never mentions it. The facilities worker who knows every patient on the long-term floor by first name and always has a word for whoever looks like they're having a hard day. The woman who comes to the information desk every Tuesday with a tray of homemade muffins for the staff, signs in as a visitor, and leaves before anyone thinks to thank her properly. The quiet ones. Once you learn to see them, they're everywhere. They are not invisible. We just stopped looking. My grandfather spent 20 years doing work that held something larger than himself together, and then spent another 25 years in a recliner in Decatur. watching baseball and bringing newspapers to a neighbor with a bad hip and offering soup to people who came to see him. He didn't need anyone to know the first part to mean the second part. He was the same person through all of it. I think that's what I didn't understand when I made those short Sunday calls. I thought the smallness of his life was the whole story. I thought I already knew who he was. I didn't know anything. There's a lesson in that, and I'm still learning it. It's not about heroism or classified files or watches with codes on the back. It's simpler than that. Every person you move through your life too quickly contains a whole interior world you will never know unless you slow down long enough to ask. And most of the time, they won't tell you without being asked. Not because they're hiding it, because they don't think they're the kind of person anyone is curious about. My grandfather thought that. I know he did. I heard it in every surprised pause when I called on Sundays. The slight shift in his voice when I asked how he was, like the question had caught him off guard, like he wasn't entirely sure I wanted a real answer. If I could do the calls over, I'd ask him a real question. Not about his knee or the Braves. Something that required him to think. Something that said, I have time. I'm here. Tell me something true. I can't do the calls over, but I can do something with what I know now. I can carry it forward. I can look at the people at the edges of my own life, the ones I've decided I already understand, and ask myself honestly whether I've ever really asked. The watch keeps good time. He was right about that. I wind it every morning before I leave the house. It takes about 30 seconds. It's the most deliberate thing I do all day. I think he would appreciate that. Thank you for listening. If this story stayed with you, I hope you'll take 1 minute today to reach out to someone you've been meaning to call. Not next week. Today. You don't need a reason. The call is the reason. This is Patient Bearing, and we'll see you next time. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since all of this happened, not in any mystical way. Just in the plain, honest way that life eventually forces you to think when you've had enough time to look back clearly. My family didn't neglect Walter because they were cruel people. They neglected him because they made a quiet decision, repeated over years, that he didn't require much. He was self-sufficient. He was steady. He never complained. And so they stopped checking. They told themselves the silence meant he was fine, when really the silence just meant he had too much integrity to ask for what he needed. That's the part that stays with me. He was so good at not needing things visibly that the people who loved him took it as permission to stay away. And he let them. Because that's who he was. He'd spent 20 years being invisible on purpose, and by the time he retired from all of it, he didn't know how to be any other way. I was part of that too. I made the Sunday calls. I kept them short. I thought the call itself was the thing, when really the call was just the minimum. The floor, not the ceiling. I was doing the least I could do and telling myself it was enough, because he never said otherwise. What I understand now is that decency isn't passive. It takes actual effort. It takes showing up when nothing is wrong, when there's no emergency pulling you there, when the person you're visiting would never in a million years ask you to come. Walter never asked anyone to come. That was the whole problem. And we let his silence do our work for us. There's something about intelligence, real intelligence, not the kind measured by tests that I think we get wrong. We treat it like a tool for solving problems that announce themselves. But the harder skill is noticing the problems that don't announce themselves. The elderly man in an apartment 4 hours away who replaces his own watch strap because he doesn't see the point in buying new. The neighbor he brought a newspaper to every morning for 4 years without mentioning it once. He saw what needed doing and he did it, quietly. Without keeping score. I'm still learning that. I'm not there yet. But I try now in ways I didn't before. I try to notice who in my life is holding more than they're showing. I try to ask questions that need real answers, not just the ones that let both of us off the hook with a quick fine and a talk next week. The watch is on my wrist right now. I wound it this morning before I left the house. 30 seconds, same as every day. It keeps good time. He knew that. He told me once and I didn't think to ask what he meant. He meant that some things are worth taking care of, even when no one is watching. Especially then. That's the whole lesson, I think. Not a dramatic one. Not one that requires any particular belief or framework. Just this, the quality of your life, and the lives of the people near you, is mostly determined by the small choices you make when nothing is forcing your hand, when there's no crisis. when it would be perfectly easy to wait until next week. Walter made those choices every day for decades and never asked for credit. The least I can do is carry that forward, so I wind the watch. I make the call. I stay on the line a little longer than I need to. It's not enough, but it's a start.